Great. I think we're going to start the session. If any stragglers come in from the coffee room, we'll let them sit down as they come in. But thanks all for coming. I think there was already another session on the SDGs this morning, and we've heard a lot about the SDGs, I think, yesterday and the day before. So I appreciate you coming here today to get a slightly different IOM perspective on these. So thank you. So to introduce myself for those who weren't previously here in the other session, my name is Elisa Mosler Vidal, and I work at the IOM Global Migration Data Analysis Center in Berlin. And what we'll be doing today will hopefully complement the other sessions on the SDGs, because we'll be speaking more from a national level perspective, what can be done to improve data on these, rather than from the international level perspective. So what I'll be doing is introducing, first of all, migration in the SDGs. I'll try and be brief about this because I think many of you probably already know about these linkages or work in them directly. Then we'll be talking about migration data in the SDGs, firstly in the context of what is needed, and secondly in the context of what can be actually done from a country level perspective. Then we'll talk a little bit about targets in the SDGs and monitoring actual targets and how to monitor targets given that migration data tends to be very poor in very important areas. Just before I start very quickly, it would perhaps be helpful for me to hear from anybody in the room if you've done any work directly on migration and the SDGs. It would be helpful for me to know a little bit about the expertise in the room, so I'll allow anyone to put up their hand and volunteer any experience they've had in this area, if there is anybody. Yes? And if you could briefly just state your name and affiliation, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, Natsuko, IOM Morocco. I think you know everyone. Not really a work done specially for SDGs, but we had like a briefing on SDGs in UNCT country team, and then those related to like migration related SDGs, and then National Statistic Agency is the one who is supposed to follow on the SDGs, and then they know very much, well, they have knowledge about migration SDGs, and they have incorporated in the survey they are doing this summer. So well, they understand the concept.
Okay, thank you. I may draw on your expertise later, because something that we'll be talking about is how to use survey data and national sources towards data in the SDGs on migration, so thanks. So firstly, to very briefly introduce the Sustainable Development Goals. Most of you in the room will at least be familiar with the broad framework. But what are they? They are 17 key goals on sustainable development. They were adopted in 2015 by the international community. We'll see here from this infographic the wild range of development topics they encompass. You will remember the Millennium Development Goals, which were the preceding version of these. And these were much more targeted and focused. They covered less topics. And in contrast, the SDGs cover very many topics. It's a very ambitious agenda in comparison. So we see here that with the SDGs, the UN intends to end poverty and hunger, combat inequalities, protect the planet, and encourage sustainable development in growth, prosperity at the societal level, and many other dimensions. There are 169 targets underneath the goals. This is a huge agenda, as you can just imagine from the number of those targets. Key features of the agenda, excuse me. They are inclusive. So the motto really of the goals is that they will leave nobody behind. And this, in the context of migration, as we'll see today, is hopefully more than just a motto. It's really about being inclusive to all population groups. And as we already know, this really is a key opportunity to improve the situation of many migrants around the world. They are also universal. So the SDG targets and goals are aimed at all countries, developed as well as developing. This is a key precedent because the MDGs, the preceding goals, were more aimed at developing countries only. So this is really a key difference. And then the other key difference between the MDGs and the SDGs is that the SDGs include migration targets for the first time. So we see here the broad range of SDG targets that include migration explicitly. So firstly, we have really the bread and butter of migration in the SDG agenda. This is really the most important target at face value regarding migration in the SDGs. So this is target 10.7, which pledges to increase safe, orderly, and regular migration and to improve migration governance. I'm sure that many of you in this room are aware of this. So it's interesting to note that this target is underneath the overall goal on reducing inequalities, which is significant in itself because it recognizes that migration can have a key poverty reduction, inequality reduction effect at the national as well as international level. I'll speed through some of the other direct references of migration in the agenda. The next is on remittance costs. So if we look at target 10.c, this pledges to reduce transaction costs of remittances to underneath 3% globally and to totally abolish transfer costs that are over 5% all over the world. So high remittance costs can unfairly burden the migrant, the labor migrants. Very often when they transfer money, they themselves have to take the burden of the high transfer fees on remittances, and this pledges to change this. Goal 8 on decent work and economic growth includes a few more explicit mentions of migration. Firstly, there is one on forced labor and labor trafficking, and then there's a second one on promoting decent work and explicitly protecting migrant labor rights. And I think this one's interesting because the SDGs are a development agenda for the whole world, right? And in doing so, it's interesting to note the different approaches are taken in different targets. So it's a rights-based agenda to a certain extent, but not every goal or target mentions rights. So I think it's interesting in this context really to see that target 8.8 on migrant labor rights explicitly mentions rights underneath a more economically driven target. So this sort of shows the combination of approaches that can be used to further the migration and development agenda in the SDGs. Goal 4 on education includes a target on increasing student mobility. So the pledge here is to improve and increase the number of scholarships available to students from developing countries to all other countries in the world. So this is a key call to increase student migration. Goal 5 on gender equality has 2 key mentions of migration. Firstly, target 5.2 calls to eliminate the trafficking of women and girls. And target 5.4 pledges to protect migrant domestic workers. Again, these are 2 very key targets. Firstly, 5.2 on trafficking. We already saw that there was a previous target on labor trafficking, and we'll see in a second that there is yet another target on trafficking, more on children. And what this really shows is the fact that there are 3 trafficking targets in the SDGs, all 3 focusing on slightly different dimensions: children, labor, and gender. Shows that it's really seen as a cross-sectoral issue, trafficking and migration-related issues, which is really a key precedent. And it sort of shows this inclusive approach sort of being put into practice. Target 5.4 on migrant domestic workers is also a key precedent. We've seen in recent years the increasing so-called feminization of migration, where more women are migrating, not as family members or wives or daughters, but also as key breadwinners of families, so they are pursuing work on their own and migrate for this purpose. And this particular target recognizes that many of these women do migrate for the purposes of domestic work, and again, this invokes a rights-based approach to protect these women and empower them in their migration processes. Target 16.2 is on child trafficking, which I just mentioned, and then finally there is a target on data on development in general, and this includes a very specific plea to increase disaggregation of all data by migratory status. And we'll come towards the end of the presentation to a little bit of an explanation of what this means in practice. What do we mean by disaggregation? How can you do it? This is a very brief overview of the main ways that migration are in the agenda. So we've seen topics on migration governance, labor migration, children, trafficking, education, gender, a real wealth of topics which I think really recognize how multi-sectoral migration is, and really thinking about implementation, how migration governance issues and migration have to be tackled by different sectors of government. So the idea behind sort of having these migration references scattered across different goals and targets is that it really enables interministerial collaboration, multi-stakeholder collaboration across different stakeholders who may not normally be involved in migration issues to, for the first time, engage on these topics. There's one further direct migration reference under the health target, health goal number 3, and this is to increase health financing and recruitment of health workforce in developing countries. So this speaks to a phenomenon common in many countries whereby very highly skilled medical professionals may be leaving a country, may also be returning, but this particular target speaks to this topic. I'm very briefly going to talk a little bit more about target 10.7. We all know what it says, but nobody really knows what it means in this way. It's a very broad encompassing target. It can mean many different things for many different stakeholders. And indeed, there's a lot of dialogue on what does the terminology within the target mean and how should we interpret this. So I'll very briefly just talk a little bit more about this. Safe, orderly, and regular migration. These are 3 sort of adjectives which are now tied to migration when we think about it on the global level, right? But there's not a lot of consensus on what they mean. So firstly, orderly, this is perhaps one of the more problematic ones. There's no definition of orderly migration within the SDGs, so it's very much open to interpretation. The IOM has attempted to define this, and it's done so by stating it's the movement of a person between places of residence in keeping with the laws and regulations governing the country of origin and travel and transit and exit into the host country. So in a nutshell, respecting the laws and regulations of origin, transit, and destination countries that are involved in the migration process. Regular migration is fairly linked to the concept of orderly migration. IOM defines this as migration that occurs through recognized, authorized channels. This is linked to the orderly migration dimension because it sort of speaks to respecting certain laws and regulations of a country or of a region. But I should add that more than really only talking about the flows or the transit of certain certain migration processes, the concept of regular migration as a whole is more also about the status of a migrant when they're in a particular country. So it doesn't really only refer to crossing a particular border, but it's also about the status of a country of a migrant once they're in a particular community or country. So we know, for example, that many so-called irregular migrants, they are not irregular because they have crossed a border in an irregular fashion. More often than not, it may be because documentation or other processes that that should be respected within a country, documentation has expired or not been renewed once they are within a country, but they did enter that country regularly. So it's just something to point out because in dialogue these days, regular and irregular migration is very often associated with borders and flows, whereas actually it's very linked to how migrants live in the longer time in a particular country or community. Safe migration, this is the last sort of adjective used in target 10.7. Again, there is no concept definition of safe migration, it's not defined in the SDGs. And again, something to point out is that it's not a static concept. So a migrant can be safe or unsafe when they travel, when they're in transit. They can be safe or unsafe when they are in a particular country. And they can even be safe or unsafe when they are deciding whether to migrate or not. So I think even though there is no common definition for safe migration, one key thing to keep in mind when interpreting it is that really it's important to protect a migrant at all stages of the migration life cycle. So it's not only thinking about migrant flows, which are often known to be very dangerous, and indeed I think we have quite a lot of evidence supporting this aspect, but it's also about migrant safety once they are a migrant settled in a new community. So hopefully this sort of shows that Target 10.7 can mean everything and nothing to a country. It's open to interpretation, and really it's a key opportunity because these three definitions don't have one key internationally set standard. There is not one box to tick for each of these, but it allows countries to adopt, if they so wish, a more holistic, comprehensive view of migration, which would hopefully protect the rights of migrants throughout all stages of their life cycle. So I've spoken very briefly about the direct, explicit presence of migration in some of the SDG goals and the targets. But what I would also like to talk about today, because I think perhaps you're already more familiar with the targets that I just talked about, was the concept also that the migration agenda is present indirectly throughout the SDGs. So the SDGs also contain targets that relate indirectly to migration. And in these topics, migration is a cross-cutting theme, and in fact, implementation of these certain goals and targets would do very well to include and integrate migration as they go along. I'm just going to talk about one particular example, which is that of health, but hopefully it will introduce some aspects of migration mainstreaming and ideas of how, in fact, all the development topics in the SDGs are in fact relevant directly or indirectly to migration. So, Goal 3 pledges to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. So the first way this interacts with migration is under the motto that we talked about this morning previously, which was on leaving nobody behind. So the most obvious way that migration can be integrated into this is to proactively include migrants at all stages of the migration life cycle, and indeed all different migrant groups, for example, including asylum seekers or refugees or labor migrants or IDPs indeed, into implementation of these particular health targets. So we see that Goal 3 includes targets on communicable diseases as well as non-communicable diseases. So there are targets on combating TB, HIV and AIDS, malaria and other specific diseases, and also on improving, for example, reproductive health of individuals. So for these, it's a very easy, relatively entry point to migration is to take an inclusive lens to these targets and really map out where perhaps migrants can have specific health vulnerabilities. Is it in transit, for example, that a lot of female migrants have no access to reproductive health? Is it a case of, in a particular country, being aware that migrants do not have access to a particular type of healthcare? Perhaps they do indeed have access, but they do not have the practical means to access this healthcare despite the policy enabling them to. So first of all, taking an inclusive lens and really taking the leave nobody behind motto to heart is the first way that migration can be included in the health agenda of the SDGs. Another key area here is on universal health coverage. So one specific target in the SDGs talks about improving health coverage to be truly universal. And this is a key one where migration is a really key issue. So when we speak about health coverage, in many countries, migrants are not immediately eligible if they are eligible for coverage in that country. If they have coverage, then there are, or access to certain healthcare benefits. There are often questions around portability of these benefits between countries. So if those migrants are to move again or to return to their country of origin or indeed move somewhere else, very often practical issues around portability or transferability of their social protection or of their coverage or health insurance can be an issue. So again, this speaks to how migration is very indirectly linked to indeed very many of the targets underneath Goal 3. A final one that I'll point out is the one target that is most explicitly linked to migration in this goal, which is that on improving the distribution of the global health workforce. This is something that many countries have, this is something which is very often in the spotlight, sort of high emigration rates of certain medical professionals, doctors, as well as nurses in certain countries. So given the sort of high policy focus of this target, it's sort of necessary to think about the broader dynamics between labor migration and health and how these impact each other at the national level. So the answers and the issues and the questions and solutions to this target will be different in each country. So perhaps one country will be seeking to encourage perhaps the return of medical professionals back to their country. Perhaps other countries would want to support the skills development of certain medical professionals and set up perhaps agreements with other countries on the distribution of these professionals once they have qualified to sort of help manage these health professional flows. As a final point, I would say here that it's important to realize that actually the migration and development agendas are very linked in the sense that improvement in a particular development outcome in a particular SDG very often improves migration outcomes and vice versa, very often improving migration governance, for example, by progressing target 10.7 and having safer so-called migration, very often impacts positively on that development outcome. And I think in terms of goal 3 and health issues, this is a really concrete way that this link can be seen. So, for example, if target 10.7 is progressed and if there is safer, more orderly, regular migration, this would likely improve the health of migrants in different countries in terms of origin, transit, and destination countries. This, in turn, will have positive knock-on effects for various different targets underneath Goal 3 on health. So it's important to realize that none of these targets operate in a vacuum, none of these goals operate in a vacuum, and more often than not, improving migration outcomes or, for example, health outcomes impact other areas positively. So that was just one very brief example on health. But on the whole, perhaps going back to this particular list of, I should add a scattered, selected topic, number of topics on the 2030 agenda, we see that migration is indirectly relevant to poverty and growth, social protection, education, gender, children, cities, climate change, rule of law, and partnerships for development. So when we speak about migration in the SDGs, we have first of all the targets that really talk about migration governance, trafficking, labor migration issues, but then we also have the broader idea that mainstreaming migration in some way, however small or large, depending on the countries, on what's realistic, is also really a key part of the 2030 agenda. I would add just briefly Goal 17, which is on partnerships for development. We see many targets under Goal 17 speaking about means of implementation. So this includes targets on mobilizing funds towards sustainable development, mobilizing partnerships towards development. I'd say this is another very sort of clear example of where migrants have a key sort of avenue to contribute. So if we think about diaspora partnerships, or other ways that migrants can directly contribute to sustainable development in origin, transit, and destination countries, we see there's another direct entry point for migrants in the 2030 agenda. And we have one concrete example actually on Goal 17 at the end of the presentation, which I'll show you, which shows how one country mainstreamed migration into their interpretation of Goal 17. So, what does this really mean for data? What do these very abstract migration and development links really mean for somebody who is trying to monitor the targets? What can really be done on the ground? There are many activities that can be undertaken at the national level as well as local and regional to improve migration data, using the 2030 agenda. And overall, because migration is present in so many aspects of the SDGs, the agenda can really be used as a call to action, a sort of catalyst, a kind of key opportunity really to frame migration data improvements at the country or regional or international level. So we have firstly the importance of disaggregating development data by migratory status. We'll come in a second briefly to an example of how to do this concretely. What are the internationally set standards on disaggregation? How is this really done and why can it be useful? Secondly, we have the sort of broader, more lofty goal almost of improving migration data capacity more generally using the chapeau or the framework of the SDGs. And then thirdly, we have perhaps a more concrete, sort of solid example of migration data and SDGs, which is how do we monitor and report indicators. So as we are aware, and as I will briefly mention, the SDG targets and goals have a set of globally set indicators, and countries are encouraged to report against these indicators. And we'll speak a little bit more about what these indicators look like for migration specifically, and what can be done at the country level to meaningfully report against these indicators if possible. So firstly, briefly on disaggregation. I'll be brief on this because I believe that perhaps in the previous session on the more global dimension of migration data and SDGs, this may have been covered. But I will briefly repeat this. So target 17.18 calls to improve disaggregation. What does this mean? Firstly, this is really important because it helps ensure that migrants are not left behind. So when we talk about improving migration data across topics, this is very ambitious and a very sort of accessible way to improve migration data using existing sources at the national level is actually to end the invisibility of migrants in existing stats and really to bring out differences and nuances in migrants' socioeconomic characteristics using disaggregation. So the UNSD recommends that 24 of the global indicators can be disaggregated by migratory status. I have some handouts that I'll share briefly, which I think has further details on this, and I think there is a link in the materials that you have which shows this list of 24 as well. But I would add that at the national level, national statistical offices and indeed other ministries can go beyond these 24 indicators if they wish, and can in general, and in fact should be encouraged to seek to see how existing data, statistical as well as administrative data, how this can be improved by migratory status, and what really is needed. Perhaps if data on health or employment conditions of certain migrants is more important, how to make sure that data collected by the relevant ministry, for example, the Labour Ministry or the Health Ministry, is disaggregated by migratory status. I would add, before speaking briefly about how to actually do this, that vertical coherence is really, really key here. So when we talk about the globally set SDG indicators, there's very clear guidance on how these should include migration data, disaggregation on this. But I would add at the national level, something very important, something which is often overlooked, is the importance of having local level data also disaggregated by migratory status. For some aspects, for some data collection, this is already the case, particularly if it's aggregated at the national level. Indeed, this already builds on existing disaggregation at the local level. But if we're talking about, for example, certain topics such as health of immigrants, for example, or healthcare access of migrants in general, very often the most valuable data around these issues will be at the local level. They may not be aggregated up to the national or regional level, simply because perhaps these data collection vehicles are not only preoccupied with migration. So if the disaggregation does exist, it's lost as the data is fed up vertically, or simply the disaggregation may not be there because there has not been a policy focus to date on migration. So it's important when a country decides to take some action on migration data and the SDGs, whatever this is, or indeed on migration and development data, or on mainstreaming migration and data, all of these topics. A really key message that I would stress is that vertical coherence of this is really key. So this means engaging local hospitals in the data collection, seeing whether they can indeed add a variable on their existing data collection sources to include something on migration. So here in the two green boxes, we have the sort of internationally set standards on disaggregation by migratory status. The two sort of key variables that are to be collected are country of birth and country of citizenship. So this enables, at the most basic level, for statistical and administrative data to be disaggregated by foreign-born versus native-born, and also by citizenship. So this would include citizens and non-citizens, and if possible, a variable, this would include stateless persons as well. On the green box on the right are further steps that countries can take, again, at the local level, as importantly as at the national level, to even to improve the detail of migration data even more through disaggregation. So apart from country of birth and citizenship, data may also be collected on reason for migration, duration of stay, country of birth of their parents as well. This is important because it can help give us data on the differences between first and second generation migrants as well. So not only the country of birth of the individual, but of their parents can be very, very interesting for researchers as well. Refugees and asylum seekers, this may or may not come under reason for migration or other variables. Internal migrants or indeed IDPs, internally displaced persons. And if possible, but very elusive in a lot of data collection in practice, is the status of the migrant in terms of their regularity. So we have on the left the sort of lowest common denominator, the most basic level of disaggregation that's recommended by the UN for countries. But on the right, we see, depending perhaps on a particular country context or local context, what variables could be added to existing data sources to get even more really important data on migrants. Very briefly, I mentioned that the SDGs can really be a sort of call to action for migration data capacity building. I think since Monday until today, we've heard a lot about capacity building, programs, guidelines, tools, good practices, and generally, I hope that a lot of the conversations we've been having between ourselves have been on this. And I would just like to stress here that the SDGs, because they include so many different ministries and sectors, and because there is such momentum around the agenda, it can really be a sort of key rallying point really for building migration data capacity. We have here a few ways concrete ways to improve data capacity in the context of the SDGs. Firstly, creating local or national migration action plans that are tailored to the SDGs can be a very important tool. So when we speak about indicators, which we will in a second, and having spoken already about disaggregation, it can be very useful to codify the sort of particular aims of a country or a local area in terms of improving migration data using these areas, and to then be able to measure progress against these objectives. Because the 2030 agenda includes so many different sectors, agriculture, health, education, etc., it's also a key opportunity to put into practice what we know is so important in migration data, which is for different ministries and agencies to collaborate. So this sort of provides, in some cases, a sort of useful entry point into interagency collaboration at the national level on data. Finally, participating in international dialogue on migration data and development data is also something that can now be done using the framework of the SDGs. So we've heard of the so-called data revolution, development data revolution. In the context of the SDGs, because national statistical offices around the world will have to report, and are already reporting on so many new indicators, there's a lot of momentum around improving improving development data at the national level, which mean that it's possible for migration stakeholders and for migration topics to be included in these dialogues for the first time, which is really a key opportunity. I'll add just one point before moving on to talk about indicators more concretely and how to measure these in the context of the SDGs. And this is that the globally set SDG indicators, there are 232 of these, several are on migration, which we'll talk about, but to date, no data exists for 2/3 of these. So I think this number sort of says a lot about the opportunity that SDG monitoring can really give countries and local governments equally. Because there's so much work to be done on development data in general that it's a key opportunity to improve methodologies, for example, on migration data, to improve data sharing for the first time on migration data, simply because there is so much upheaval right now on development data. It's really a key opportunity to include migration in these conversations. So, monitoring and reporting on the SDG targets very concretely. What does this mean in practice? What do countries have to do? All SDG activity, just as a sort of fundamental point, needs to come back to the follow-up and review process of the 2030 agenda. This strengthens accountability of countries towards the agenda. It allows them to monitor progress over the years and indeed to keep doing so hopefully after 2030. A strong indicator framework is also valuable as it helps governments use data and evidence to inform their own migration and or development policy and programs. So here we have a list of the globally set indicators that relate explicitly to migration. I will not run through all of these, but these relate to the direct targets that we saw at the very beginning on migration. So on migration governance, trafficking, distribution of health workers. These are the internationally set indicators for these. So this means, in theory, that countries and governments have a responsibility to gather data on these indicators and report them at the global level at regular intervals until 2030. So just as one example, on the health distribution of workers, target 3C, indicator 3C1 calls for countries to measure health worker density and distribution. So for example, this data normally comes on density, for example, from the World Health Organization. And this is globally, internationally comparable data, which shows, for example, how many medical professionals, indeed often from different sectors, are available per 10,000 individuals in that particular population. A lot of these indicators can be produced using international level data. So the WHO, as we just saw, provides data for one of these indicators. The ILO and the World Bank are other examples of international bodies that lend data toward these indicators. For example, on compliance to labor rights under target 8.8, and also in remittance costs under target 10.c. So this is a sort of international sort of benchmarking opportunity really for a lot of migration topics. However, going past these global level indicators, there's also a lot of leeway and a lot of opportunity for governments at the national level to report on these or indeed other indicators relating to migration and the SDGs. So the message here is really that governments can develop also their own national indicators in parallel or in addition to these, depending on data availability and on particular objectives. If all global indicator data were collected, this would improve comparability. Obviously, these are very, very valuable indicators because they allow us to compare between countries and regions different progress on migration topics. However, many of these global indicators have underdeveloped methodologies in relative terms. So there are different categories for methodologies for the global indicators. Many of these indicators that we have just seen are labeled Tier 3, which really means that they do not have established methodologies yet. This is because, as we know, migration data is difficult, it's elusive, it's very patchy, it's between different ministries. There are many, many challenges to migration data, as we all know very well in this room. So this means, as a sort of function of this, a lot of these global level indicators are very hard to concretely put into practice. It's hard to get a lot of data on those indicators, particularly at the national level. Further, not all of those global indicators are relevant for national use. So if I briefly ping back and we focus on 10.7.2, we have the number of countries that have implemented well-managed migration policies. This, I should add, is a new indicator under development by UNDESA and IOM, and indeed it's going to be a very, very internationally relevant tool which allows us to compare migration governance between countries. However, that indicator cannot be used at the national level by a country itself because it measures by default the number of countries that have well-managed migration. So we see here how there's a little bit of leeway and a little bit of scope for national migration data to improve responding to these indicators in a way that is tailored. So proxy indicators allow for SDG targets to become more context specific. If we also see that, as we saw, that migration is relevant to many targets apart from the ones that are directly relevant, for example, on health and education or also on partnerships, as I briefly mentioned, the global indicators for those targets are not on migration because those targets are not fundamentally on migration at the international level. So again, developing proxy indicators sort of allows countries to adopt a migration lens when they're developing these indicators, if they so choose. I have a few examples of these sort of proxy indicators and how they may be relevant. I would add really that the SDG framework, there has to be a balance between globally comparable indicators on migration data, and indeed that's why this international indicator list, which is very valuable, exists. But I would just add that in some contexts it can be useful for governments to, in parallel, develop their own methods to monitor progress in migration. Before any indicators are produced, even if they are global or if they are proxy, it's necessary to carry out a data mapping exercise. So this is really to do a sort of comprehensive mapping of what data sources are available on migration in a particular country, what data is captured, how is it processed, who is it shared with, how is it reported on, etc. I would add that this data mapping is something that many countries have done outside of migration. So many of you working in different countries will be familiar with many national level efforts to do this across the SDG indicators. So this is not only about migration. But what could be sort of done in this context is to create a list of potential migration data sources and actors in a particular country. So if, for example, a country wishes to implement targets on trafficking, for example, and then a few targets on education, but taking a migration lens, perhaps because they wish to focus on a particular issue, like improving education for immigrants in that particular country, keeping these targets in mind then and the SDG goals that are most relevant to that country, a data mapping exercise could then take place to see what's already available. So this includes making a list of sources, actors, including government partners as well as non-government partners, if relevant, and holding interviews and consultations with government partners to really see down from the local to the national level to the sort of horizontal spectrum of different ministries what migration data is available relevant to the SDGs. And we have an example here of how this can be done for target 10.C on remittances. I hope you can see the text on this slide, but what it shows is a sort of suggested template to collect data on migration data in that country. So this can also be used beyond the SDGs very clearly because it's a sort of systematic way to collect data on the metadata in a country. So information on the institution, the migration data collected or received is collected. Further details are recorded on how it's collected, how it's received, how it's stored. For example, what's the level of automation that the data has on a database, these sort of monthly written records which are then aggregated. These sorts of information points are gathered in this template. Who is the information shared with, if anybody? So is there any automated process between agencies to share this data, for example? And finally, how is this data reported? How much, for example, of national level data on volumes of remittances are reported publicly? Perhaps on a national level there are aggregate figures available, but perhaps some detail is lost in this national level reporting on what regions receive the most remittances or even what cities. So the level of detail of the data reported can also sort of improve, can often be improved. I would add then, so this data mapping template can be used for different purposes. But in the context of the SDGs, it can really provide a concrete way for governments to see how they can monitor specific SDG targets. Very briefly, some guiding principles on developing indicators, if indeed some proxy indicators are developed. They should build as far as possible on existing migration data collection and management processes and mechanisms, recognizing that the SDGs present a large burden to a lot of national statistical offices and government. It's also about being realistic about, is it possible to establish new data collection mechanisms on migration data, or is it indeed more realistic to use existing data? So it, for example, would involve looking at survey and census data already collected on migration and seeing how best to use this. Indicators should reflect priorities at the local and national level. They should have data that can be produced on a regular basis over time. They should also be from reliable and well-established data sources. And really a key point here is, if any proxy indicators are developed, they must be as comparable or consistent as possible with any internationally set standards as possible. This is really key here because the SDG agenda is overall a global agenda. The aim is, as far as possible, to be able to not only monitor progress at the national level against these topics, but also to be able to compare between countries, what does progress look like at the regional or international level. So if a country does, for example, develop a particular indicator separate from the global list of these, there are very often international standards on migrant terminology, for example, or other parts of the indicator that can be sort of used to ensure some level of comparability internationally. I'm very briefly going to speak about an example of some proxy indicators that were developed in Armenia. I'll run through this very quickly because I would really like to hear from you sort of your inputs into this, and then go through a very brief group exercise on this so we can get more sort of practical around these issues. But in the case of Armenia, the National Statistical Office chose to develop new monitoring mechanisms for the migration SDG targets in some cases. So here's an example of 2 SDG targets that Armenia chose to monitor on. The first is target 10.7, so on safe and orderly migration. The National Statistical Office in Armenia went through a consultation with different ministries to identify within target 10.7 what are the priorities for Armenia. So we've seen target 10.7 can encompass any range of topics, and to make it a bit more concrete, a consultation was held to sort of determine what are the priorities for Armenia in this target. The answers were, among others, that return migration is a key topic, and also asylum processes. These were 2 key sort of policy focuses at the time. And in turn, to reflect these, 2 proxy indicators were developed to measure progress in those 2 areas. So firstly, one of these is the percentage of returned migrants who undertook paid work during the last 7 days. So specifically around return migration, the labour market reintegration of returning migrants was a key focus. So if there are returning labour migrants from neighbouring countries or also from further afield, what is really the outlook in terms of reintegration? How are they being employed? If they are being employed, how can we help reduce, for example, their underemployment or unemployment? So this particular target can actually be generated using the existing household survey that Armenia already collects on an annual basis. So this involves disaggregating results of employment from that household survey by migratory status. The second indicator that was produced here was the proportion of individual asylum applications granted. So at the time, Armenia was experiencing a relatively sharp rise in asylum applications mainly from Armenian Syrians, but also from other populations. And so a key policy focus that came up in the consultations was really how to monitor progress of Armenian institutions to responding to these. And so using, again, existing data sources from the State Migration Service, which is the sort of ministry in charge of migration governance at the national level, a proportion of applications granted was chosen as a key way to monitor progress towards target 10.7. And I like these two examples of indicators because they really show how malleable the framework is. So I should add that in parallel to these indicators, Armenia is also reporting on global indicators across migration topics and also other topics. But because these topics that were of national importance were also sort of given salience using the SDGs, it was kind of seen as a key opportunity to also develop indicators that were very, very concrete and responding to needs at the country level using the SDGs. The last target that I'll mention here briefly, that there was an indicator developed for, was 1716. So target 1716 calls to enhance the global development partnership. This is left very broad. It's basically a call to mobilize all sorts of partners towards sustainable development. And in this context, it was chosen to include diaspora members into sort of metrics on this in Armenia at the national level. So the indicator developed here was the number of development initiatives where Armenian nationals abroad are included as active partners. This indicator is a bit of a precedent because it actually includes data sources from different ministries and agencies. So the two previous indicators were also using existing data sources, but they're using single data sources, so the survey and existing records from the State Migration Service. This indicator is interesting because it aims to collate data and information on diaspora programs of different kinds from different agencies. I should add that these indicators are currently undergoing a validation process in Armenia, but the plan is very much for the National Statistical Office to then be able to report on these on a regular basis until 2030. So I hope that with this sort of very brief overview and then with this concrete example of Armenia, I've kind of shown that because migration is present in so many areas of the 2030 agenda, past the more obvious links of 10.7 and labour rights, the aim was a little bit to show how migration can indeed be mainstreamed in different ways in the agenda, in different topics, first of all, such as on diaspora engagement, but also in different ways of implementation, including, crucially, on monitoring. So really the message is that the migration SDG agenda is broad, but it's really what you make of it. So it's very possible to come up with new mechanisms to measure very, very concrete topics of national interest using the SDGs. So I think I'll pause very briefly for questions first for a few minutes, and then I'd like to spend about 20 minutes or so doing a bit of a group exercise to be a bit more interactive. So please let me know if there are any questions, comments, or anything else based on the presentation until now. Thanks. Please, yeah.
One quick question. Since I was here for the last session with you on migration profile, could you please tell me if there's any link to integrate like SDGs indicators to like migration profile? Just want to see.
Any more questions?
Thank you very much for the very comprehensive presentation. And I also want to thank for the reference to UNSD in identifying relevant indicators for the SDG monitoring, because I was from the UNSD originally. My question is that, as you mentioned that when it comes to the data gathering or generation at the country level for the purpose of SDG monitoring, it is expected that NSO, National Statistical Office or Statistical Authority, is expected to take a lead in collecting data and also, communicating, as you said, that interagency mechanism very, very important. How do you see the roles of the academics and NGOs who are also very keen on gathering and offering statistics for the monitoring. If you have any idea.
Yeah, thank you very, very much both for your questions. Firstly, I'll answer the question on the migration profiles. Thank you. Indeed, the link between migration profiles and the SDGs, in a nutshell, I would answer this is open to interpretation and open to, it's really about the art of the possible at the national level. So I would say that the SDGs are a really key opportunity also for migration profiles to introduce better data perhaps on migration and development for the first time. I would say that's a concrete sort of area of synergies between the two areas. I would say that not many, so some migration profiles since 2015 do attempt to map certain data areas to SDG goals and targets, which is very valuable. So I would say that's to date what's already existing in terms of overlap. But I would say actually that they're very complementary. So if we look at migration profiles and the way that they map data sources in a particular country, that can actually form the basis for a country to then develop SDG indicators or to see if they can indeed report on the global ones. So I would say migration profiles, if they're sort of comprehensively and effectively done, are kind of a stepping stone, if used effectively, towards SDG monitoring.
It's more, capitalizing, it's, I don't know if there's any country who has like made a link. It's more convincing if you are reporting, not only the migration profile, but reporting the SDGs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I can think in terms of the most recent migration profile that I've seen that makes pretty explicit links to the SDGs is the Ghanaian migration profile, which should be released shortly. And I think it's fairly impressive the way that it makes direct links in each topic covered in the migration profile. That links sort of why this is important in the SDG context, and I should add also to the GCM context. Increasingly, the mapping of these objectives can be done. I agree, we should capitalize on the momentum, absolutely, and on the sort of processes that migration profiles often build. I would say this is an open area of activity given that the agenda was adopted fairly recently. But yeah, very much the sort of complementary processes. Thank you for your question on sort of non-government partners, perhaps, and sort of the role that they can play. It's an interesting question because the 2030 agenda does explicitly call for national statistical offices to report on the indicators. So thank you for pointing that out. In terms of concrete official responsibility, it is the NSOs who are meant to report on these indicators, and we really should not forget that. But I would say that does not sort of exclude the role of other partners at all in data gathering and also perhaps more in data analysis in this context. So first, in terms of data collection, I mean, I can point to the example of Armenia on development initiatives using diaspora members. This also includes non-government data. So there's a few diaspora organizations which operate on a very large scale, which will be contributing, hopefully, data towards this indicator, which will be collated by the NSO, indeed. So I would say, firstly, in terms of data mapping and data collection, it's necessary to include other actors. But because data needs to be so reliable and timely, and often it is simply governments that have a better overview, I would say the role for academia and others is perhaps more in data analysis of migration data in the context of the SDGs, particularly because this covers so many topics where migration mainstreaming is just starting to take place in certain countries. Because these linkages are so difficult to quantify, a lot of research is simply needed on methodologies to collect better data on this, on analysis of what data we do have. So I would say that the role of non-government partners would be more to assist government in research, perhaps, on analysis of these different linkages, with the hope, indeed, in the nearer future to then sort of be able to collect better data on the government side on these. Any more questions before we proceed? Okay, thank you. So we have about 15 to 20 minutes left, and I actually wanted to hear perhaps more from the group on how this would pan out in practice, what it really means to take an SDG target and monitor it. What does it really mean? And I wanted to see how concrete we could get with just about 20 minutes in this one room. So there are some handouts. Which I will ask you to kindly take one of each and pass around. Thank you. And so you will have two handouts. One is a worksheet for you to fill out, and one is on the different SDG targets and indicators relating to migration. But if I could just please ask one or two people from each group to briefly stand up and let the room know what target was chosen or what SDG goal or target, and sort of what the brainstorming came to, what data sources you think may be available in some countries, what conclusions you came to. I'll let you decide who goes first, so I'll wait for a volunteer perhaps. Okay, this group is going first. Executive decision. Thank you very much.
Okay, we chose the health indicator, the 3.C and 3.C1, so health workers, density and distribution. So I think we just discussed what's the status in our countries, so it's different in the different countries. So we all agree that in all of our countries, I think the data are collected by some sort of local health units, so at a low administrative level of the health system. At province or district or whatever health unit level exists in the country by the health institutions, and then they're aggregated at regional level and then at national level. So, but we didn't know what kind of information goes up to in terms of health information system. You may collect more information in the institutions, but then what actually goes up at the higher level and the national level may be less disaggregated or less information, because normally health information system work like that. And then in terms of institution collecting data, we have Ministry of Health and Institute of Statistics, because we would need the number of doctors, probably by birth and citizenship, by location, by type of doctors, and the number of people in the location, so that's from the census or the administrative units in the regions, whatever, to get the population to calculate the density. Probably yearly, it's something that reaches the national level yearly. We didn't know if there's more often. We hope that there's no Excel, and we hope that it's all electronic through like an official system, and there's no flying paper. And shared with the institution in different countries was shared with different institutions. So we listed Ministry of Planning, Social Welfare, Finance, or anyway, different. So it can be different in different countries. And then we didn't discuss more than that.
Great, well, thank you very much. I think hope is the operative word there as well. Also, in terms of hope is a very operative word there. In terms of Excel versus automation, it's about the art of the possible very often, right? So I think you're right there. Thank you very much. I'll invite the second group. You have a microphone. Thank you very much. It's the red button.
Yeah, we were discussing, we choose the target 8.7. It's the one on decent work and economic growth. Yeah, we were trying to think about the institutions that could provide information on child labor. Obviously here we come from different countries, so everyone was thinking about their own countries, and we have different difficulties on finding one institution in common. So we made a list. We thought that maybe we can find information through the Ministry of Education, through Human Rights Watch, maybe through police reports on child labor, if child labor is illegal in the country, and maybe information from the labor ministry, and someone suggested to do surveys in the districts in which the phenomenon is visible. But we then have a further discussion on the other issues here in the questionnaire.
Great, thank you. Thank you both for also choosing different topics. Very useful, I think, based on the very brief overview that I've had from both. It's really how many different stakeholders are ideally involved in these data collection processes, right? And I think in the context of the SDGs, that's something that comes up again and again, whichever target you choose. You realize, I think, very quickly that it's not only one agency in charge of this data collection or management ever. So I think also with the health target, the local health units were mentioned, which means also it's important to remember the vertical coherence aspect and how important this can be. And we had from your group so many different stakeholders, from police to education ministries who were involved. So I hope that sort of served to illustrate a little bit, to show how wide the net must really be cast to get sort of migration data on these topics. I think we have to wrap up now, but thanks very much for your input. I'll be available today and tomorrow to talk a little bit further about these topics if you have particular thoughts about something at the country level in your areas or not. But thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.